back to the second part. So the goal of the following section will be to give you a bit of context. This, or all of the following, is actually not really material for the exam, but rather should give you a bit of a perspective how the topics we'll be discussing in the next weeks to come fit into the current context of what's around. Yeah, so we'll be talking about physical simulations, and this is actually in a way very old topic. So we're dealing with equations that are in a way really old. So Newton's famous laws were written and published by him in around 1660. So these still found or give the basics of all of the following physical modeling. Yeah, right. This is a picture of one of the remaining copies of his work. The basis for the whole mass spring system part, I've mentioned before, that we'll deal with quite a bit in the next weeks, is actually similarly old. Hooke's law, basic elasticity of a spring, is almost as old as Newton's laws, and this actually still plays a major role in many physical contexts beyond springs. Actually, a bit newer, but still almost 200 years old, is a model of fluids, and around a similar time also electromagnetism, Maxwell, and so on. There were a couple of developments in the physical field. Right, so point being, the physical models, the equations, are really old. What changed substantially, what is a lot newer, is that we have computers that can actually compute solutions, approximate solutions to these models on a large scale and very efficiently. And this is around, Zuse von Neumann, the 40s, basically around World War II, 1940 to 1950, this really took off. And since, I'm sure you all know, we've seen a vast rise in terms of performance. So one of the milestones in 2008, also more than 10 years ago now, was this Roadrunner architecture with the petaflop, and by now, the hardware seems to change a bit. We're moving towards these kind of GPU parallel architectures, but nonetheless, the compute power we're seeing is still constantly rising. And in a way, this is also what makes it possible to really compute interesting things with the physical models. So this is really one of the crucial things, and one of the reasons we're talking about this in this lecture. One other thing to point out here is that, in a way, all these physical models typically have a certain goal that we should keep in mind. So very traditionally, you basically have certain pillars of scientific methods in general, really. And in a way, the classical ones were theory and practice. Basically, we had the experiments, which give the data from which to derive the theory. And in a way, you could see it as a third pillar here. We relatively recently have computations that augment, or to a large part replace, real experiments. And it's become extremely important for a large variety of simulations and situations in science. In a way, now we're leveraging similar tools here in this context of game or interactive physics. And we have slightly different aims in this context from the classical ones. So you can argue that one of the most important part is kind of that things look correct, which sounds a bit vague. It's a bit more difficult to quantify that, but nonetheless, for humans to believe a certain effect, some important bits of the physics probably have to be have to be right, or there have been studies that show that a large number of parts, like conservation of momentum, mass, and some core concepts actually are easily detected by humans, so that we have to get right. That's one part of it. And the second part is basically, in this context, what's crucial is typically that we only have a very limited amount of compute power. That's severely limited. We cannot, even in worst case scenarios, just easily take much more. And things typically need to be very stable because we have a relatively chaotic and free environment of users interacting with these physics. So in a way, these constraints and goals that we have deviate at least partially from the traditional ones in, say, regular computational science application, and hence part of this lecture will actually target these differences and algorithms that have been at least partially tailored towards these representations, towards the desired representations for real-time animation. Right, so this is also for physics in games, what crucially drives how these physics in game applications have developed over the years. So now I want to come to a bit of an overview of what has been going on here historically in computer games. And unfortunately, now I'm sitting alone in my room. Now I would like to ask the audience what you think were the first games and when those actually came up. So that doesn't properly work now, but nonetheless, I want to ask you to think about it for a moment. What do you think? When did the first games come along that actually incorporated physics, or what were the first games you can imagine? When did they actually happen? I hope some ideas came to mind. Well, the reason I'm asking is that many people in the lecture would probably think first of Pong, which is a famous candidate, very widely known one, but it's actually not the first one. So the very first one, or the very first game we can officially credit as a computer game, was known as Tennis for Two in '58 actually. And here's a nice video of this game in action. It was actually played on an oscilloscope with a custom controller that you can see here. And right, the very first game is actually, in a way, this is a pure physics simulation, right? They didn't have much resources for fancy graphics. This oscilloscope couldn't display a bitmap. This is purely driven by the physics of the ball and the collisions and the bounce of this ball. Yeah, another pretty early one. Okay, some actually also remember this one is Space War. This was also run on a mainframe back then. Also small space simulator with gravity. You have these two spaceships, and there's kind of the main star in the middle here that attracts the spaceships, and you have to try and escape its gravity while shooting at the other player. As you can see here, so now one of them crashed into the main star. And yeah, it's obviously wrapping around. Hit. Yeah, that brings me to the most famous one, Pong. I'm sure you all heard of this one. This was officially published in '69. Actually, some documents credit to '72. I haven't been able to confirm which one of the two it was. Around the '70s, basically. Yeah, and also Pong is now actually more of a bitmap-based display. Back then, they also actually, the first versions had a custom controller, but nonetheless, right, it doesn't have a big story or complex levels. What's driving it is basically the physics, the reflections of the ball, and the two players interacting. So But in a way also, all of the examples so far have really been strongly driven by the physics. Yeah, another one that is good to mention here is Mario Bros. In '85. This is probably not what you would traditionally mention when being asked about games with physics, but if you actually look at the history of Nintendo in general, a lot of the gameplay and the interesting components of the games were actually driven by physics, and also especially for Mario Bros. In a way, one of the key novelties back then in '85 was actually the character with its momentum that you had to learn to steer and control on screen. That was a big part of the interesting gameplay. Then another very good contender in this physics overview is Incredible Machine. This is in a way now a more extreme example. This is a pure sandbox game, right? So here the whole game revolves around this physics environment. It's basically allows you to set up experiments and let the physics run. And within that scope, you have certain goals. You're given a set of ingredients with which you have to reach a goal. So in this case, you actually have to blow up the fish tank on the left-hand side. And now this is being run. Rocket launches and mission accomplished. So this is one example of what's possible in this physics sandbox. Yeah, another thing that I'd like to mention here is Descent. It's not really a physics game, but this actually was the first game to be fully 3D. And interestingly, it kind of failed because of that, because it was too much. So previous games had more of a 2D map with 3D visuals, but essentially moving in a plane, and our Descent was really fully 3D, and that actually was too confusing. It actually took away part of the fun. You could rotate in all directions, and levels were all around, and it was new. It was the first game to really do that, but in a way, people couldn't cope with it that well. So, interesting aspect of such kind of technical feats is that if it's too much, it stops being fun. So you need to kind of find a balance between things that are intuitive or open enough, and things like flying on your heads, which become much less fun for players. Yeah, another whole range of games targets driving simulators. In this case, the interesting bit of the physics is really recreating the behavior of a real car, and Gran Turismo arguably started this whole trend of, back then, even then, basically it claimed to be highly realistic physics, by now much further, of course, but nonetheless recreating the complexities of really driving a car, also with the sliding effects, friction, and so on, in a computer game. And again, the majority of the gameplay here is actually dealing or learning how the physics of such a car behave. The thing to note here is that actually there's no damage model here. The cars didn't get damaged at all. They couldn't break. I'll come back to that later in newer versions, but that turned out to be something that back then was just too complicated to incorporate. Another fundamental step in terms of physics in computer games was Max Payne with the ragdoll physics. I'm sure you don't know, basically having, in this case, mostly for dead enemies and so on, these ragdoll effects of rigged characters, essentially a set of rigid bodies with joint constraints, but probably the first case where this was really used on a larger scale and as part of the main game. Yeah, then a nice example is Half-Life 2, another shooter, but in this case, yeah, probably, I think you can argue it is the first game that really was able to pull off 3D rigid bodies as part of a gameplay and make it fun, in contrast to Descent. So here, one of the tricks is this gravity gun that you can see here that you can use to modify objects relatively easily. And here in this case, actually, I hope you can see it a bit on screen. One of the tricks is actually you have this bar here that tips over. The player has to reach the far side of here on the right of the bar, and to be able to jump over, there's not enough here. You need to basically stack a lot of heavy objects on the far side so that when the player walks to the other side, it doesn't tilt, and the player can actually jump across to this ledge. So that's one of the examples of the rigid body type puzzles that were part of Half-Life 2. And needless to say, this was a big success. So this was one of the things that the players actually ended up liking most about the game. So I think soon this should be enough. So right now, finally, the player is on the other side and can open the valve of the tank here. Yeah, this was actually kind of pushed even further with Gary's mod, also part of Half-Life 2 in 2004, turning this into a whole sandbox of physical puzzles and levels, and this all kinds of crazy follow-up ideas. One different area that I think is worth mentioning is the Star Wars game here. This was 2008, and as far as I know, also this is one of the very few games that really modeled whole volumes and breaking and deformation effects. Also something we'll get to later on in the lecture, but this is actually quite tricky to do, and this is a game that pulled that off quite impressively with a relatively realistic model. There are actually some research papers on the technology behind that. But again, if you read up on how the game evolved and so on, one of the key challenges kind of was to make this physics so controllable that it ended up being fun. And you can break a lot of stuff, but then you can easily, for example, damage or make it impossible to reach the end of a level. So it's a bit tricky to guarantee that the game stays fun. Oh yeah, one of my favorites. This is a nice game that one of the first ones that kind of turned fluid simulations into a real fun gameplay. And here, this is a 2D game. This is supposed to be an app for cell phones. You have a 2D particle-based liquid simulation with the water. You can actually see the individual drops. And with your finger, you can basically swipe to remove the earth here and let the water flow around. And then there are all kinds of puzzles in this kind of small simulation sandbox. And this also is a nice example of, in this case, 2D physics, 2D fluid physics turned into a nice game. Yeah, back to cars. This is now a nice example. This is actually, I think, more of an engine. But now in 2015, I've mentioned Gran Turismo before. As far as I know, this is the first engine that actually allows for real car damage and deformations of the hulls of cars, as you can see here. But there's a nice technical feat and definitely a non-trivial a case of physics, but in this case really needs a specialized engine to pull that off. Well, another nice example in 2015 is this Just Cause game, third instance actually, and yeah, this is now on a somewhat newer architecture. This was from PS3, I think, and in a way this game is fun because, as you can see in a moment, this now allows players to really aim for large-scale Hollywood-style destruction effects. Also in a quite free environment, in a pretty flexible setting. So now we're, at least in terms of complexity of the physics, really approaching what normally you would need to pre-compute for movies. Yeah, coming to a more stylized example again. This is from 2017. Nonetheless, a nice example of a collaborative multiplayer game that's driven by also pretty complex rigid body and deformable physics. And this is now less realistic, but nonetheless, I think a nice example of the kind of fun that you can create and interesting gameplay that you can create with physics simulations. So, as you can see in this case, right, the players had to use the mass of the players to tilt open that door and work together to get across this ledge to the castle. Yeah, and this is the last example I have from real games. If you actually know of good further examples of physics-driven computer games, please let us know. We're always looking for updates to the list. But with that, I want to give a bit of an outlook of what I think will come. So, right, kind of a bit historically, also in our group, in terms of research, I think these kinds of fluid and braking effects are particularly interesting. And this is a nice tech demo from NVIDIA. It's also by now a few years old, but it shows a bit the complexity of physics that we could by now actually compute very efficiently. But that's still missing from computer games. So I think this as an outlook would be something that free liquids and freely braking environments, something that would be hopefully not too far away. Right. Also, these kinds of flow effects. This is now from one of our own research works. This is something that we are still missing in games, but I think in a way the technology is there, so hopefully we'll get to see that soon. This is another full screen variant of this cloud of smoke, and right, I think, oh yeah, well, just a bit of smoke, right? It doesn't look so complicated, but if you think about it, it's actually a volume. You really need to simulate the whole space and basically every part of how this smoke material moves around in the three-dimensional space. In this case, this whole box was actually more than 1,000 cells across, so you literally have billions of update steps here for such a simulation. It's costly. Yeah, and looking ahead, I think having in a way procedural interactive worlds is still one of the big milestones. There have been some games in 2D that could pull that off a bit, but really having a 3D environment that in a way allows you to flexibly interact with every tree. If you want, you could break off a branch of it or even a single leaf or so. And some games actually allow that, but typically it's still essentially scripted. It's essentially pre-authored. So really having a physical environment that allows you to do that, that models the behavior of wood and how leaves are attached and stability of the walls and so on. That is something we are still missing, I think, at the moment. And yeah, now looking ahead, I think one of the interesting potential directions for this is actually to leverage machine learning to deal with the complexity and essentially learn reduced models for the physical interactions. And once we have that, hopefully also we can move towards the next steps and actually have characters that behave physically, that have cloth that deforms according to physical laws, and players in a virtual environment that are able to interact with the environment realistically. But yeah, the dots here should indicate, I think, there is quite a variety of challenges still left, especially on the 3D front. I think 2D is in a way better tackled. Yeah, but with that, I want to summarize this introduction part so far. So we can use physics as special effect, kind of like in movies, to make things look nice, but I hope also quite a few of these examples actually show that, in a way, what's more interesting and important, you could argue, in this context is really having physical rule sets as means for gameplay, as drivers of the actual game, rather than for eye candy, basically. And that brings me to the end of this part. Thanks so far.